I got those skills and stuff.
Okay, welcome to First Universalist of New Madison on this bright, cheery summer day. Not too hot, not too sticky yet. So we've been pretty lucky this summer, actually, even early in the morning like this with no air conditioning. Any announcements? Glad to have Roberta back. Hope you're doing all right.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Let's see, we're looking at the 9th. Are we talking about the session in the park?
September 10th.
September 10th. We'll be in the park, so kind of keep that in mind with El Dorado. Lloyd is going. Yeah, you can come in.
Yes.
There's Golden. There she is.
What's your stuff?
Sorry.
Not a problem. Okay, Lloyd is going to be going to Delaware the Sunday after, right, for the races.
Sometime in the middle of September, I think.
Yeah, so I think it's the Sunday after the park. So we're not going to have music that Sunday, and then he's going to be playing at El Dorado the Sunday after that. So it's been suggested, and I don't see any reason not to, we might all just go to El Dorado with him. I mean, I don't think they're going to object. And that way we don't have to, because we'll come up with music one way or another, even if I have to have a record. Yes?
Maybe by then I'll be playing.
Oh, that would be great if you could play. I would prefer that, obviously.
Well, we'll see.
Okay. Actually, I've heard that they've got one-handed piano pieces. Yeah. I heard one of them on YouTube. It was actually pretty good for a one-handed. Some piano professional player lost his arm or in an accident or something and decided to play one-handed and wrote his own compositions, and they were actually pretty interesting. But I'm not going to make you learn how to do that in 2 weeks. All right. Any other announcements? The fair's coming up in next week.
Friday
Yeah, next
starts
Friday.
fair.
So everybody's looking forward to that. What else? There's something else. Oh, thank everybody for voting. Issue 1 lost by a large margin, a really large margin, like 57 or 56 to 43. And the interesting thing was there were many counties or many districts or many election sections where the people who voted Trump had a majority in the last presidential election voted against changing the Constitution, which tells you even conservative people still have an idea of what true conservatism is. So we're glad to see that. And because of that, and thinking about all that, we ended up with where we are today, which is, if you've been watching the news, and I'm not sure whether I'm doing this because the news changed or because I just am seeing more of it, but the Israeli democracy is having some problems. So that's what we're going to talk about is democracy and Israel. And that fits into kind of the broader picture of what we tend to talk about a lot, which is what's going on with civilization in the world tending toward conservatism. It's Hungary, Poland, even countries like Sweden and Denmark, traditionally liberal countries, the populist movement is kind of rising up, and people are becoming anti-immigrant and more conservative. So that's part of our continuing investigation, is just what the heck is going on. Okay, our prelude is Summer Knows. Nice summer tune. For chalice lighting is for Yom Kippur, which this is not Yom Kippur, but that's the one we're using because it is kind of an Israeli connection. We light our chalice, symbol of our faith for truth, sought through a questioning heart and attentive mind, and for love, pursued through obstacles inside and outside of our own human heart, and for forgiveness and all it entails, the place where truth and love meet and merge. Our opening hymn is 219 in your hymnal.
Amen.
and lead us to a mastery or drives in us that war pursue. Kind of convoluted, but asking that what is it in the human nature that makes force and using force the first resort in any dispute? And that's what we'll be talking about quite a bit with the Middle East, but it's not just limited to the Middle East. Okay, affirmation. I can feel the suffering of millions by Anne Frank. I can feel the suffering of millions, and yet if I look up into the heavens, I think it will all come out right, and that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, or perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out. And as you know, Anne was not able to carry them out. She was hidden in Amsterdam when the Germans, the Nazis, invaded Holland or the Netherlands. They hid there for 2 years, a year and a half at least, before they were turned in and discovered by the Germans. She was sent to a concentration camp along with her mother and sisters and her father. Her father was the only one who survived. This was toward the end of the war. And she died not of being executed, but of typhus, of a disease. But it doesn't make any difference how you die in a situation like that. But Anne Frank, a young girl, 14 or 15 years old, still having faith, still having hope, and her father published her diary when he was released from the prison camp, and it has made a tremendous impact on the world. Okay, joys and concerns. I think we have to start with Maui. At least 90, some are listed as dead now. The last I heard, there were more than 1,000 people still unaccounted for. The death toll here could be astronomical. There was no warning. The winds were hurricane winds with no rain, just hurricane winds were blowing over 80 to 90 miles an hour. And a small fire just blew right straight through the town. The electricity went down, so the sirens didn't work. There's some people complaining that there weren't any warnings ahead of time, which would be the sirens, but if the electricity's down, the sirens aren't going to work. There was no phone notification set out, and I think, from my understanding, events moved so quickly, the people in charge of sending out the warnings didn't have time before they were scrambling to save their lives. And numerous people, if you saw the pictures, were trying to get out of town in their cars, lined up. The fire overtook them, and they jumped into the ocean. So the ones who could move and swim survived. They don't know how many bodies they're going to find in the ocean of people. They already have found bodies on the street that didn't make it. And many of the missing are probably people who were in their house, older people, young kids, people who couldn't move very fast. When you've got a wind blowing 80 miles an hour, you've got to be pretty spry to outrun that with that kind of horrendous fire and damage behind you. So this is going to be an ever unfolding disaster as we go along. The town was completely, almost burned to the ground, everything. That was a historical town from the beginning of Hawaii. Actually, it was the capital, and Hawaii was a native monarchy before it was taken over by the Western countries. So ages and ages of history have been lost there. So, a candle for Hawaii and the dangers there. My sunflower, I didn't get it watered quite enough last week, so it's looking a little bedraggled. But I guess that would be matching the Ukraine. Ukraine is looking pretty bedraggled too. The Ukrainians are still holding up their end. They attacked a Soviet or a Russian tanker out in the Black Sea. They have been sending missiles at the bridge that the Russians used to supply Crimea, yeah. And they've also been sending some drones actually into Moscow itself. The difference is the Russians always say we are retaliating for what the Ukrainians did when they send drones to Ukraine. The difference is the Ukrainian drones are targeting military bases and military supply places. The Russians are targeting blood transfusion centers, hospitals, retirement homes, and just apartment blocks. So the unequalness is not to be ended yet. Glad to have everybody here who was able to come, and particularly those, Roberta, with a injury. We called Cecil last week, left a message. We called 2 weeks ago, and we were late because we were having a meeting, so I figured she was out to lunch. Last week we called about 10:30, and she still didn't answer. So if anybody knows what's going on with Cecil, we may need to call her during the week or see if we can get a hold of her and make sure everything's all right. I said in the message that we all say hi, and that if she needs anything, please let us know. Anything else? Yes, Mike.
Tim, if you'd like a candle for my late friend Dan Philbrin, he passed away actually last Monday at the age of 97 years old.
97.
One of those gentlemen who lived a full life, grew up German Baptist, and later affiliated with the Church of the Brethren, and just was a wonderful person. Dedicated to his family, very humorous, a great sense of humor, loved to have fun, and it was still very evident. I think one, particularly at my age, I guess now, I do attend funerals or what have you, but the fellowship after the service was phenomenal. That was so indicative of, I think, Dan's wonderful life. Dan Philbrin.
We celebrate the life and the passing of Dan. And there's not much difference between the German Baptists and the Church of the Brethren, except Church of the Brethren can wear ties. Right, anything else? Right, we'll light one final candle for those who have problems, those who have worries, those who have things they cannot vocalize or cannot express to others, maybe some things that they're not even aware of themselves. We are here to support you in any way that we can, so please do not hesitate to ask. All right, our children's story. Oh, let me go to our next Israel. The reason I picked this up is, you know, about I told you my history in Germany and being there during the separation from East and West Germany and the Berlin Wall, where I lived a couple of blocks from the Berlin Wall. This is so evocative of Berlin and the wall that divided the one side from the other side. The word apartheid is being used with Israel. That is not something anybody would have ever expected. The Israelis have a long history of consciousness of what goes on in the world and sensitivity to what goes on in the world. And that is kind of what we will be looking at a little bit today, is trying to understand how this country, beleaguered as it is, surrounded by enemies, can still turn, I guess you would say, to the dark side. They built this wall to divide the Arab population, the Palestinian population. The stipulations are very strict about who can come over and who can't come over. And it's one of those situations, just like apartheid in South Africa. The stricter and the more difficult you make it for people, the more certain people in that little group are going to react, and react violently. So it's a cycle of violence that continues and continues to this day. So, in our little children's story, is not a children's story, it's a little history. Let's see if it will play.
This video was brought to you by Ground News. When Netanyahu was sworn in as Israel's Prime Minister for the 6th time last December, no one expected it to be smooth sailing. His cabinet included a host of unpopular right-wing firebrands, and his legislative agenda was nearly as controversial. Perhaps the most contentious part is a bill giving Netanyahu almost complete control over Israel's judiciary and Supreme Court, which has sparked unprecedented protests across Israel's major cities. So in this video, we're going to take a look at that new bill, why it sparked such massive protests, and whether Netanyahu can get away with it. So let's start by talking about the judicial reforms themselves, and how Netanyahu justifies them. When Israel became a country after World War II, it didn't really have the time or political bandwidth to sort out a complicated political system with all the relevant liberal guardrails. So instead, it just went for pure proportional representation. And instead of a formal constitution, over time the Israeli parliament, otherwise known as the Knesset, passed a series of semi-constitutional laws known as the Basic Laws, which became sort of an uncodified constitution over time. However, the absence of a formal constitution means that the relationship between Israel's judiciary and the Knesset is pretty much undefined. And while this worked for a while, in the 90s, the Supreme Court started using a couple of new basic laws related to the rights of Israeli citizens to dismiss various pieces of legislation passed by the Knesset. Obviously, this created a tension between the Supreme Court and the Israeli government, which has sometimes accused the court of being anti-democratic and using controversial and narrow interpretations of the basic laws to dismiss any other legislation that it doesn't like. Anyway, Netanyahu has apparently decided that he's had enough of this ambiguity and has introduced a bill that would essentially redefine the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Knesset. And he would largely achieve this by giving a lot more power to the Knesset. That's because in its current form, Netanyahu's bill would basically do three things. Firstly, it would give the Israeli government more power to appoint judges, who are currently picked by a panel mostly composed of other Supreme Court justices and lawyers from the like-minded Israeli Bar Association. Secondly, it would reduce the court's ability to curtail or dismiss certain laws which relate to stuff like national security. And thirdly, it would introduce a so-called override clause, requiring a simple majority of 61 MPs. But in practice, because the government usually controls a majority in the Knesset, this would give the government the power to ignore the Supreme Court on essentially any ruling they didn't like. Now, while he doesn't deny that the bill would represent a drastic rewriting of Israel's constitution, Netanyahu argues that this is a necessary remedy to the Supreme Court's increasingly activist nature. Netanyahu has also accused the Supreme Court of being undemocratic and obstructing the will of the people. And politicians in his government have pointed out that the court doesn't even reflect Israel's wider society. And to be fair, they do have a point here. Israel's judges are generally more secular and liberal than your average Israeli citizen. And there have been few Arab or Muslim judges on the court in the past, despite the fact that Israeli Arabs make up something like 20% of Israel's population. However, not everyone is convinced by Netanyahu's arguments here. His stubborn attempts to get the controversial bill through parliament have triggered massive protests across Israel, especially in Israel's more urban areas. In fact, last Saturday, hundreds of thousands of Israelis marched through Tel Aviv to protest the new law, in what one newspaper called the largest demonstration in the country's history. The protests have also united Israel's usually divided opposition, bringing together tech workers, university students, lawyers, LGBTQ+ associations, centre-left Zionist parties, Arab groups, and even former IDF officers. And while each of these groups focus on different issues, as we see it, there are four distinct oppositions to the new law. The main one, though, is a constitutional objection, that the law would remove the separation of powers between the judiciary and the parliament that defines almost all liberal democracies, and instead open up Israel's politics to the worst excesses of majoritarianism. Now, as we said, Israel already has far fewer checks and balances than your average liberal country. It's only got one legislative chamber, no devolved powers, and the head of state, i.e. the president, has no veto over legislation. That means that Israel's judges are basically the only significant check on the power of the government, and neutering them would open Israel's democracy up to what political theorists call the tyranny of the majority. Basically, when there are no checks and the government only needs a majority to be elected, then they're liable to pass laws that violate the rights of minorities who were never going to support them anyway. And this is an especially pertinent worry given the nationalist character of Netanyahu's government, and the fact that they've already introduced a controversial law that would ban, quote, terror-supporting Israeli Arabs from running in elections. The second objection, though, is that even if you think Israel's constitution and the relationship between parliament and the courts needs reform, this should be done via cross-party consensus. Israel's former Prime Minister, for example, has suggested that reform should be designed by a cross-party committee before being put to a popular referendum. And this is part of a wider anxiety about the functioning of Israel's democracy, which has seen 5 elections in just the last couple of years, and might be unable to cope with a whole load of short-lived constitutional convulsions. The third objection claims that the bill isn't really about fixing the constitution, but instead about protecting Netanyahu and his ministers, who are currently beset by legal problems. That's because a few days before Netanyahu's government was sworn in, a law was passed to allow his interior and health minister, despite the fact that he had a conviction for tax fraud earlier in the year. The problem is, though, that this law was overturned by the Supreme Court in January, and Netanyahu himself is currently on trial for corruption and bribery relating to commercial relationships he had with certain Israeli media moguls back in the 2010s. So the theory is that this law would basically provide immunity for Netanyahu and his political allies as long as they continue commanding a majority in parliament. The fourth and final objection is about Israel's economy. That's because Israel's economic miracle is partly attributable to its relatively stable political institutions and its appeal to left-leaning tech workers who don't like what they see as Netanyahu's authoritarian efforts. And as a result, many of Israel's tech and business community have joined the protests, and 2 former central bank governors even sent an open letter to Netanyahu warning that weakening the Supreme Court's independence could affect the country's credit ratings. So that's what the new law does, and those are the objections to it. But what happens next? Well, despite enormous protests, Netanyahu does seem undeterred, and that's because he claims that the protests are trumped by his election victory in November, which he's described as the mother of all protests, and as such, he's pledged to push on with the reforms. All in all then, unless one of his coalition partners gets cold feet, it looks like the reforms are set to go ahead. And the main question now is whether Israel's political system can survive the upcoming turmoil. Netanyahu will be hoping that it can, but with protests continuing, that's far from certain. So if you want to follow the protests and the unraveling as it happens, the best way to do so is with ground news. Now, we all know that algorithms work behind the scenes to determine the information that we see online. So Ground News was created to give you access to as many diverse perspectives as possible. That makes Ground News a website and app which can help you actively burst your media bubble. It lets you compare how breaking news stories are being covered across the political spectrum. For every news story, you can see the number of sources reporting, as well as the political bias of those sources. And that's important, because the same story can take on a totally different meaning depending on how it's being framed. And this becomes really clear when you use their blind spot feature, a newsfeed dedicated to the stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. Here you might discover information that challenges your perspective, or simply helps you understand someone else's media reality. You can even keep track of your personal daily reading habits with a personalized dashboard that shows you tons of stats about where the news you're reading.
That's basically an ad for Ground News, which I've been following because, as it says, it gives you an awareness of who's putting out what and what each side says, and it gives you the opportunity to look at each side and know what side it comes from. But let's go back to the presentation. I know this is kind of dry. It's like we go into poli-sci class in junior high school or whatever. But the reason I'm pursuing this, or the reason we're bringing it up, is when they talk about the lack of control over the Knesset, the lack of control that Netanyahu would have over him, does that remind you of anything that we might be familiar with? The Ohio legislature is gerrymandered, and gerrymandered means that it's been set up so even though the Ohio voting population is approximately 53% conservative, 53% Republican, and 47 or 48% Democratic, The legislative districts are all apportioned 75% conservative and 25% liberal. The cities have all been hemmed in where the liberal population lives, and the counties, the rural counties with much lower populations have been divided up to give them the stronger voting control. This is essentially what is happening in Israel, and that's the reason we're talking about it. They talked about the tyranny of the majority. That's a majority of 1 or 2%. This is what issue 1 was all about. The majority in the Ohio legislature wanted to set it up so the people themselves could not change the Constitution without a 60% majority. 60% is almost impossible to get in a population where everybody has a choice and everybody is exposed to advertising. And some of the hypocrisy was unbelievable. Talking about the vote yes for issue 1 to protect the Constitution. Protecting the Constitution means the ability of the people to change the Constitution, not to lock the Constitution is where it is. The hypocrisy is just mind-boggling, basically. Okay, so that's why we're talking about Israel. That's why we're talking about what is going on in the Israeli parliament. Any comments or questions on the kind of long presentation here? They covered lots of things through there. I think they did it in a fairly instructive way, a little bit dry without any personal examples. But that's the reason we have these pictures. This is a picture of the other side of the wall. This is a picture on the Palestinian side. And just like any issue, there is no all right or all wrong. There are good things on each side and there are bad things on each side. The Palestinians, the Arabs, we can do a little history here. Israel was formed in 1948 after World War II. It had been a British protectorate, Palestine and into the Middle East. They just divided it up and gave the Jews basically the state of Israel, and was surrounded by Arab states who all objected to the state of Israel. And so the country was formed in 48, and immediately 1948, the Arab countries attacked the state of Israel, the newly formed state of Israel. The Jews had learned from what happened during the Holocaust, and they were not going to sit by idly and lose their country. So they basically fought back with the assistance of Jews from all over the world. And they pretty much skunked the Arabs and took part of the Arab territories that surrounded them. That did not end anything. This was the Arab League at that time. And all that did was inflame the passions on both sides. There were atrocities on both sides. The Jews actually even committed atrocities against the British when the British were ruling Israel before it became a state in 1948. There was a group called the Irgun. Menachem Begin who was the prime minister of Israel and at a later time was one of the leaders of that group. They blew up a hotel that was filled with British servicemen. They did terrorist actions against the British, trying to drive the British out. So no side has clean hands, no side is without blood on their hands. And there's no justification for it on either side. But this is something that everybody needs to be aware of. The next one was 1956. Everybody has heard of Moshe Dayan, the guy with the eye patch. That was the next war against the Arabs. That basically started as a manipulation by the British trying to take the Suez Canal back from the Egyptians, back from Gamal Abdel Nasser. They inspired the Israelis to fight the Arabs, and then they wanted to come in as a peacemaker and say, we're going to take care of the Suez Canal, and that way we get control of the canal and everything else will be separated. What happened in that situation? Is anybody aware of that? Eisenhower was our president in the United States. Eisenhower said, you're not going to do that. So he stepped in and said, you're not taking the Suez Canal away from the Egyptians, because that's a sneaky way to do it. So that's what happened. The war was over. The Israelis maintained their territory and took more territory on the Golan Heights, but the Suez Canal remained in control of the Egyptians. In that sense of Nasser being supported by the United States, which nobody expected, led to, and you know what the peace thing was between Begin and Nasser, two people who you would never think would shake hands and have a peace treaty. Israel and Egypt recognized each other shortly after that. And what was the result of that? Nasser was assassinated by people who did not want to have peace with Israel. So the cycle goes back and forth from one side to the other over and over and over again. I want to go back to kind of an overview. One thing I started out with was authoritarianism can be defined in many ways. A judiciary subservient to the ruling regime is one of them. That's what we're talking about in Israel. Right now, Israel was formed in a hurry. That's a parliamentary style government. They do not have a constitution. They did not sit down and write a constitution, and unfortunately they didn't copy the constitution that we use in the United States. So all they have is one legislative body, not two. There's not a legislature and a Senate. There is only the Knesset, which is the legislature, and the judiciary, which is basically their Supreme Court. So they have a real slim proponents for checks and balances, and that's what basically no one would expect a court in Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, North Korea. We've all seen the way the courts operate in those countries. They do whatever the government tells them to do. Israel has not been in that category up till now, but this is what Netanyahu is trying to do. He's trying to make the Supreme Court where his party, the party in control, can elect or appoint members of the Supreme Court. And he's trying to make a situation where if the Supreme Court says you can't do this, he can go back to the Knesset, have a majority vote, not at 60%, just a 51% majority vote, and overrule the Supreme Court. This means you basically have one-party rule, just like in Russia, Turkey, Iran, North Korea, and maybe Ohio. And one of the reasons they do this, I don't know if you heard in the presentation, some of the people in the government, including Netanyahu, are being brought up on legal charges, bribery, tax evasion, all kinds of legal problems. Does that remind you of anything in this country? Does anybody have any doubts what would happen if the conservatives were elected for the next presidential election? Anybody who's been charged with attacking the Capitol would be pardoned. Anybody who's been charged with crimes against the country would be pardoned. We would basically be in the same situation as Russia, Turkey, Iran, Korea, and possibly Israel. So, and that's one of the things that Israel has always bragged about all through their history. They are the only Middle East democracy, and that is true. The Israelis have one of the few populations where everybody can vote. Unfortunately, 20% of the population of Israel is Arabs, Israeli Arabs. They are Arabs, but they are inside the boundaries of Israel. And they have the right to vote, but their vote is basically circumscribed. There is actually a party in the Knesset that represents the Arabs, but it has no power. And that's part of the reason is the way they were set up with their parliamentary system. It only takes 3% of the voting population to get a seat. Now, if you look in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, any of the other parliamentary democracies, England, you have to have a large percentage, not a huge percentage, but like 12 to 15, 16% of the vote before you get a seat. That keeps the little tiny fringe parties, the little tiny fringe people from having seats in the Knesset. With only 3% required, the Knesset is full of all kinds of variable people with extreme views from one side to the other. One of the downsides of populism. And what's the reaction to that? What happens when you have all these individual people? What happens when you want to form a government? You have to create a coalition. There is no one party that has a majority on their own, so all the little parties get together. And how do you get little parties together? How do you get their votes? Simple term is you buy them. You can say you're trading, but basically you're buying them. So how does Netanyahu get the little conservative parties to vote for him and to do what he wants? The ultra-conservative Israelis do not want to serve in the military. Israel has a mandatory draft for men and women. Everybody serves their 16 months in the military. And then when you leave the military, you become a reservist and you're liable for call-up. This is how Israel has managed to defeat the Arabs in their multiple wars, as the reservists are all trained and armed and ready to go at a moment's notice. The conservative Jews do not want to serve in the military. That's one of the things that Netanyahu has promised them. If you vote for me, and you know who the conservatives are, the little hair that comes down the side and the little pillbox hats, those are the very conservative Jews. If anybody's interested, we'll do a little history on Judaism as we go along. But those people do not want to serve, and they are the ones that want to enforce strict Judaic laws, which means you can't work on the Sabbath. For the Jews, Saturday is a Sabbath. You can't cook. You can't even turn on the light switch. That's considered work. So everything has to be prepared ahead of time. You can't travel. That's considered work. But one of the more interesting things about Judaism, if you look at it, is it's what's called a legalistic religion. I find that very interesting. And part of this came from, as I was going through the reading, in 63 BC, one of the Jewish rabbis in the city of Jerusalem said, "It is very important for every Jewish child at the age of 6 years old to learn how to read." And somehow, and I'm not sure how this happened or maybe something to look at, education became very important for the Jewish religion, for the Jewish people. Everybody is taught how to read, and the thing they love most, the Torah is their book of religion, that's our Old Testament. They love to argue about the Torah. They love to sit in discussions and say, this is this way or this is that way, and somebody will go back and read scriptures. And there's hundreds of Israeli scriptures that we don't know about that they go back and read to. They will argue about this for days and days and days. So education is very important. Is that what led them to become bankers, business owners? Or partially, as we know, during the Reformation, business was considered something that educated people, that cultured white people didn't do. It was considered a lowly occupation. Because everybody pushed the Jews away and segregated them, they said, make the Jews do it. And the Jews took to it with alacrity. They took their reading and education skills and their money counting skills, and they became the bankers of the Western world and assumed power. And the kind of humorous thing about it is they were made to do that by the people, the kings and queens and barons and all the Western powers, the French, the Germans, the English, who did not want to be troubled with those trivial things like business. So they made the Jews into the business people, and Jews accumulated control over land and money. And then whenever the king wanted to go to war, he had to borrow money from the Jews. So they became the power brokers in the world, and they are still being blamed for that today. You still will hear in conservative circles that the Jews are running the world through a cabal of bankers in Geneva, Switzerland. George Soros is constantly harangued by the right for being in control of everything. George Soros does use his millions to support democracy in Hungary, which is where he is from, and is castigated by the Hungarian right-wing people. And he's the famous bugaboo of all the American conservatives. Anytime you hear there's some kind of information campaign going on, it's always George Soros, which is kind of a shielded, little quiet way of being anti-Semitic. George Soros is Jewish. So the anti-Semitism continues even to this day. People tell you there is no more prejudice. We all know that's laughable. Just as a sidelight, that I assume everybody saw the fight in Montgomery, Alabama at the riverboat, where the white people in a pontoon boat had docked on the side of the river. The city of Montgomery has its own riverboat, an actual 3-story riverboat with a paddle wheel that they give tours on. It came back. It has a specific docking place along the riverbank. This white guy's pontoon was parked there. They asked him to move the pontoon a few feet so the riverboat could dock and the passengers could get off. They refused. So the black co-captain of the riverboat landed on there and untied the pontoon and moved it a couple feet out of the way. The 3 white guys who were on the pontoon basically attacked him and were beating him to a pulp. on all the black people who were surrounding and said, we're not going to do that. And they all came to their defense. And in Montgomery, this is the state, or this is the city where we had the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they turned the police dogs and the fire hose loose on the protesters in the 60s. Police arrested 3 white guys for attacking the black guy, which was pretty amazing. The only black guy that was arrested, did you see this? He picked up a folding chair and was beating people over the head. So now there's a meme going around of Martin Luther King, the statue in Washington, D.C. Have you seen his statue carved out of marble? They've added a folding chair to it, which is kind of funny. So, but that guy was arrested for using a weapon against people, which that's considered not allowable. So that's kind of a sidelight. Okay, the Palestinian Arabs, as I said, make up 1/5 of the population, and they have Israeli voting rights. But the Israeli-occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip do not have voting rights. Those are the people behind the wall. There have been numerous incidents of Palestinian terrorist attacks. 1 or 2 people will either shoot or stab or drive a car over somebody. Nobody says anything that that's right or not right. Nobody acknowledges that that's anything that should be done. But it's like a pressure kettle, a steam kettle. If you keep turning the heat up and turning the heat up and keep clamping the lid down, pretty soon that little cork, the safety cork in the top is going to pop out, and some of the more extreme people are going to do things that they shouldn't do. One of the reasons they do that is the Israeli settlers are the most extreme in the right wing, and they have representation on the Netanyahu's government. They actually attack Palestinians. They cut down their olive groves. They slaughter their sheep and their goats. They build settlements in Palestinian areas. They tear down Palestinian houses. The Israeli Supreme Court, which supposedly is a liberal supporting democracy Supreme Court, does nothing about this. The settlers are allowed to roam free. It is a difficult situation. There's more information you could go through, but that's the base of it. Questions, comments?
I was impressed by the balance in that thing you read or that you had there during the kids' story. That was actually a very balanced explanation of what's going on in Israel. I heard that one of the objections to letting the Supreme Court overrule laws is that there is no, as you pointed out, Constitution. Now, how do our Supreme Court supposedly goes to the Constitution, and then the people on the Supreme Court, they interpret areas of the Constitution, but the Constitution is always at the basis of what our Supreme Court does in terms of whether a law is constitutional or not. How can a Supreme Court function if there is no Constitution? Then it's basically just somebody's opinion whether a law is good or not. And if you're going to be, as it was in the old days, appointed by a committee of lawyers and legal people, then you're basically letting a little group overrule democracy. And you said something about during your sermon a one-party system, but actually it's far from that. It's a many-party group that's running, the conservative group that is running the country. And so, and as far as democracy goes, and I've said this many times here, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And you see what democracy ends up in. You have the majority oppressing the minority. And that's something that you're always going to get in democracy. And down there in El Salvador, so long as the democracy was running that country, there were gangs, there was violence. Well, they decided to heck with that, so they brought the military in and squelched the gangs. But now they're in danger of losing the democracy there. So was it because the democracy made it easy for the gangs to exist that you had all that violence? So we humans are really bad at government. Democracy is our best system, and it is there. And that's the problem in Israel, is that you do have a democracy. And Netanyahu did get a majority of the Knesset for various denominations. And they have said that, well, this bogus group, this judiciary, we're going to stop them from stopping the democracy from doing what they want to do. And don't get me wrong, I think there should be a judiciary there. And I'm not for what Netanyahu did. I really not. But still, as that guy pointed out, I thought it was a very balanced presentation what you played there. There are arguments on both sides. And if you look at the internet, they tend to make Netanyahu the majority of the Knesset look really bad. And I think the protesters in Israel make him look really bad. But even though I'm not for what Netanyahu's doing, I can kind of see some logic behind that judiciary. What is it based on? There's no constitution, so it's just your opinion whether a law is legal or not. Is that? And it's kind of that way in our Supreme Court because they have to interpret the Constitution. But at least there's a Constitution that you have to deal with. There's none there. So
That's the problem, Mike.
From what I've learned from your presentation, I thought the video was very good, very informative. And the governance issue, because of that lack of a constitution, which is illustrated clearly, is causing internal problems. What did you read in terms of those internal governance issues? Were they basically going to detract from any efforts, possible efforts of the long-standing settlements of the Mideast instability, or is it going to aid? Is it going to increase that instability in the entire region, or is it more likely that it's going to just basically stay status quo? I use that almost, presidents have attempted to settle in various ways diplomatically the tension in the Middle East.
As long as Netanyahu is in power and conservative votes. And part of the trouble is, and that's true with any fractious democracy, the liberal side, the people on the left, can't agree. In other words, you have an Arab party, and then you have a Labor Party, and you have a Liberal Democrat Party. But if they can't agree and put a cohesive platform in front of the public, you've seen that thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are protesting. The protests are so bad. Remember they talked about the former members of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force? There are thousands and thousands of reservists who say they will not serve in the military if called up because of this right-wing coup, what they call a right-wing coup in Israel. Businesses are beginning to abandon Israel. Israel is a real focus of intellectual property, intellectual inventiveness. A lot of the computer programs, some of the not so nice ones, the ones that invade your cell phone, they all came from Israel. Those people are moving, they're leaving Israel because they do not want to live in a country that's going to be beset by all kinds of revolution and anti-democratic things. That's the intellectual business leaders, the people who have the moral authority but do not have the power in the country. Those people are leaving. Now they're not leaving in like mass droves, but if you look at the economic progress of Israel, it is starting to go down. And the reason it's going down is these companies are not investing in Israel anymore. They're taking their money out of Israel and moving it to other countries like the United States and Australia.
So that lack of governance then, or at least that lack of a constitution and the instability that's resulting, is actually going to increase Israel's vulnerability.
Yes.
with its neighbors that are historically been quite threatening.
And that's kind of the way democracy works, and that's our only hope is as the situation becomes worse, the people who voted for conservative right-wing causes because they were moved by their emotions begin to see it's like global warming. Well, these people who say there's no such thing as global warming, are they going to be convinced by the rising ocean levels in Florida? Insurance companies are pulling out of Florida because they can't afford to insure houses anymore because they're flooded and destroyed so often. And the insurance rates are so high that nobody can pay. That's nothing the government's doing. Those are private companies are saying the risk is too big. That's the one thing that I look at and I'm trying to figure out and trying to understand. And this has happened to civilizations throughout history. At the beginning of civilizations, I don't care if it's the Roman, the Greek, the Egyptian, all these civilizations have started out as nothing and they've grown up to control the world and then they've fallen apart. Why did they collapse? Why did they fall apart? My initial supposition is at the beginning, people had loyalty to the country, not to themselves, to the country. Cincinnatus led the army in Rome. When the fight was done, he turned over his generalship and went back to his farm. Washington could have been president for 3 or 4 or 5 terms. There was no set term in the Constitution, how many terms a president. After 2 terms, he said, it's someone else's turn. I am going to relinquish my power. As the country gets older, fewer and fewer people have loyalty to the country, and they have loyalty only to their own party. They say, this is the guy I want as president. If the vote didn't go for him, then the vote must be wrong. We're going to pick our own electors. We're going to send them to Washington. We're going to invade the Capitol. We're going to change the vote, and we're going to make our guy president, even though the vote said he's not supposed to be president. And we'll do anything that we have to accomplish that. That is the sign of loyalty to the nation, loyalty to the Constitution, disintegrating, and greed and personal loyalty, personal greed taking over. I think that's what's destroyed the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Chinese civilization that collapsed, the British Empire. The British had the biggest empire in the world. What happened to it? Why did it collapse? It just didn't collapse by itself. There was a reason it collapsed. Part of the reason was the American Revolution. What was the American Revolution based on? Somebody over in Parliament saying, we want more taxes from you to pay for our stuff, and our people saying we want representation. It's a long story, and we're way over time now, so. Any other comments? Do you want me to shut up on this stuff in the future? Because you're going to get more of it, so. Okay. Hopefully that stimulated you to think a little bit. And I don't know if you saw the thing we put up there, voting is important. I should have put that on there. I'll bring it up next week. Let's see, offering. We're going to hear sunrise, sunset. As usual, if you can share, please do. If you need something, let us know, and we'd be happy to share with you. nice sunset, and let's hope it's not the sunset of our democracy or anybody else's democracy. Closing hymn is 336, All My Memories of Love. That's a somber song to end with. All right, extinguishing the chalice is an interfaith benediction by Gary Kowalski. Gathered in our varied faiths, we give thanks for the blessings of the world community as we share our common dream, hopes and schools where children thrive, neighborhoods that are safe and clean, a city rich in colors and cultures, an economy where no one is expendable, a beloved community where rich and poor alike have access to the opportunity for a dignified and productive life. Churches, mosques, and synagogues and temples where our deepest hope is to be of service to a hurting world, enable us as we leave this place to carry forth this prayer into the coming week, turning our thoughts toward charity, our hearts toward justice, and our hands toward the work of peace. Shalom and amen. A postlude, polka dots and moonbeams. Polka dots and moonbeams, good way to end. I don't have in between the ears. As I was going through pictures, I happened to run across this one. Anybody, you recognize what's going on here? This is Glacier National Park. This is a group of tourists, complete idiot tourists, because this is a grizzly bear 30 feet away. Grizzly bear standing up looking for tourists.
That
This-
doesn't look like a grizzly bear.
It is a grizzly bear. And the reason I picked this up is this is Glacier National Park. We were there a few years ago. And this is kind of hard to see because I have my camera on extreme telephoto because we were like 150 yards away. This is the grizzly bear that we saw. It's munching berries off of this tree. But that is the distance you're supposed to be at from the grizzly bear, not what these people are, which is, and even if the grizzly bear stood up and you didn't see it, you wouldn't be standing there saying, ooh, look at that. You'd be turning around, walking away very slowly and very quietly. And if you've been to Yellowstone or Glacier, any of those places, they tell you that it ring bells, and they give you pepper spray, and that's the running joke out in Montana and Wyoming and Colorado, is when you find bear scat, and you know what bear scat is, you'll find little bells in it, and it'll kind of smell like cinnamon. So, all right, there is coffee back there, there are rolls and chocolate chip cookies that I found on sale. Have a good week.
Good. Good to see you, Roberta.
Thank you.
Is your son still doing state parking work?
He's retired, though